Justin and I are here from Canada, and both Justin and I have quite a number of years of experience working at Statistics Canada, which is Canada's National Statistics Office. Without going on at great length, Statistics Canada actually has a very good reputation worldwide as a leading national statistics agency. And so this morning I want to start off by just describing a little bit about how Statistics Canada goes about its work. So let me now describe how Statistics Canada practices international best practices. Now, firstly, Statistics Canada is at the heart of a centralized statistical system in Canada. That means that Statistics Canada is responsible for conducting most surveys in Canada. It has a very strong network of surveys. However, there are agencies outside Statistics Canada which also engage in data collection. Where that occurs, however, Statistics Canada has the authority to access the information collected by other organizations. What is slightly unusual is that Statistics Canada even has authority to access tax data, which in many countries is kept highly confidential. And in Australia, for example, which also has a very good centralized statistical system, the Statistics Office does not have that authority to access tax data. Where Statistics Canada has that authority to access data, however, it is under strong legal provisions to keep that data entirely confidential. And that is part of the strong legal authority that exists in Canada governing the operations of Statistics Canada. That authority not only requires information to be kept confidential, it imposes penalties if officers of Statistics Canada divulge confidential information. The authority, the Statistics Act, also requires companies and individuals to provide information to Statistics Canada if that information is requested. And there are penalties also for companies or people who do not report the information they are asked to provide. The next item on my list is interagency coordination and collaboration. And I have already covered that in my remarks. The next item, however, and these are all activities that reflect best international practices. They are really a necessity for a good statistical system. And one of those things Statistics Canada does is to maintain a business register of all businesses in Canada. This information is very important for the conduct of business surveys. So that business register is at the heart of the business surveys that Statistics Canada carries out, so that they are all consistently based. A part of the information within the business register is a classification of businesses by activities and various other characteristics. And it is important that those classifications be internationally consistent. In the past, we used a classification based on the ISIC, the International Standard Industrial Classification. But more recently, we have developed a system specific to Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And this system is called the North American North American Industry Classification System. And I might just add, one of the reasons for that is that economies develop more quickly than the classifications that reflect them. So a few years ago, there were no companies that produced cell phones and various other devices you can think of. And since Canada is very closely connected with the US economy, we are under a greater need to update our industry classifications regularly. That is one reason why we We use our own North American classification. Another important aspect of Statistics Canada operations is data quality assurance. This means that after data is collected, it is very carefully reviewed to ensure that it's correct or at least makes sense. And this sort of quality assurance, this sort of check, is carried out at the level of the individual return that we receive, and it's also carried out at the aggregate level. The questionnaires are checked, are compared with earlier questionnaires submitted by various companies, and when the data are processed into GDP or the balance of payments or various industry aggregates, they are also checked at that level. The next important process that is implemented at Statistics Canada are fixed release dates. So at the start of the year, Statistics Canada will publish what the release dates will be for each of the data series that are published. This is also one of the international best practices defined by international organizations. And it is required, for instance, under what's called the General Data Dissemination System. That is a system which was developed initially by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in cooperation with other international organizations. And it is a standard to which Mongolia, I believe, has fairly recently subscribed, is the term they use. Finally, I'd like to point out that Statistics Canada operates largely independently of the political process. There's a strong tradition of independence for Statistics Canada, so we conduct our surveys without interference from the minister in charge or other interest groups. As an example, possibly our two most important releases in Canada are gross domestic product and the balance of payments. And I should add the unemployment rate and I guess the consumer price index. When those statistics are released, they are given only to the Minister of Finance and the Bank of Canada a few hours before they are released. Just as a closing comment, I might add that the politicians, particularly the Minister of Finance, is not in love with Statistics Canada. We are always giving out bad news about inflation or the unemployment rate. Sometimes it's good news, but I would like to just emphasize and to use a term that has recently become popular. Statistics Canada is not in the business of fake news. So in fact, Canadians do look to the Statistics Agency for credible information. That concludes my remarks.
Sambano, I will just provide a very quick summary of my experience at Statistics Canada. Basically, it's a career that has lasted some 36 years. Over this period, I basically worked in economic research on foreign multinational enterprises. I was also manager of the Capital Investment Survey for many years, which is an important indicator for the GDP. I also was responsible for a while working in the labor force survey, where there's indicators of employment and unemployment. And at the end, I completed my career with almost 10 years in the energy statistics program. And this is what brings me to the presentation on Statistics Canada's energy statistics program and all the surveys that were conducted. Today, the presentation will cover these various topics. I'm not going to mention them, but here they are. This is a saying from Lord Kelvin, and basically I relate it to statistics. If you have good statistics, you can have good management. I want to put energy in a much more global context in terms of the evolving challenges. This is a slide that I borrowed from the International Energy Agency. Basically, it outlines some of the major events that have impacted the energy markets over the years. And again, when I say energy, we have to remember, especially here in Mongolia, petroleum, coal are important factors. At the bottom right-hand corner is the latest factor in terms of the Paris Climate Accord. Now, this is an older slide, but again, it shows how having good information, good energy information, or good statistics on petroleum, coal, and other energy, you can start calculating energy intensities within Mongolia and with other countries. And as you can see, Canada has got energy intensity that's quite high. And this is more a reflection of the types of industries that we have in Canada. And the pulp and paper industry, iron and steel, smelting and refining. These industries all require large amounts of energy in their production. What Roger mentioned before, again, is energy is used by, it's applied to and used by many external users in important departments. In the first example, we have energy and economy and GDP, etc., investments, etc. In the second bullet, you talk about energy security. I had some discussions with some representatives here about in 1990, where you had the Russian embargo vis-a-vis oil and some of the problems that caused. And the third one, it's the energy and the environment. There's a definite correlation. So where do we use energy in Statistics Canada? What are the petroleum, the coal, the electricity, the natural gas? It's one of the first things where these statistics are required is in your system of a national account and getting your GDP information. And as Roger mentioned, there is a central statistics agency, but this information is shared with some of the provinces under strict legal definitions. One important factor is in terms of who are the data users, who uses the information that you publish. And we have found that we have our companies that report to us, our industry associations, analysts. This next slide shows the list, examples of all the departments that will be using our statistics. This slide also shows you the impact that your statistics can have on policies and decision making in other departments. This next slide is pretty busy, but the key message that is in this slide is the partnership that Statistics Canada has with other provincial agencies, with companies and regulatory agencies. So not only does Statistics Canada conduct its own surveys, but it's getting information from all of these other areas to put together to get the energy statistics picture. We'll take data from universities also. Now, a little bit more about the 21 surveys. Most of the surveys are census and not sample surveys. Now, there are 21 surveys, and I'm not going to bore you with the description of the 21, but I will concentrate on a few of them called coal, coke, natural gas, petroleum. But most surveys, and not all surveys, have some key information that they go obtain from companies. So we try to get information from the supply side, and in terms of production, imports, inventory, and transformation. And we also try to look at the demand side of energy in terms of domestic use and exports. In terms of domestic use, I was very happy to find out that the National Statistics Office is conducting a survey on energy production and use that will be released at the end of this year. But the end objective is your energy supply and demand, or the energy balances. So we have all these surveys, we need a framework within which to work. On the left-hand side, you have your supply of energy, whether it's import or production data. And just as an example, again, in terms of partnership, import data, Statistics Canada has surveys. The National Energy Board provides us some information. And the International Trade Division provides us information. And then you have your total demand. On the consumption side, domestic consumption, there's a specific survey on industrial consumption of energy within the manufacturing sector. But here again, here's a little interesting thing in terms of domestic use. Our electricity companies and our gas distribution companies classify their customers according to the NAICS. So we're able to get use of electricity and gas through these partnerships with these companies. This is the coal and coke. I mentioned I was going to only touch on a few surveys. This is the coal and coke survey. The data that is collected is mentioned in terms of production, imports. I'm not going to read all that, but exports, stock, supply, disposition, revenues, are all information that we collect. There are 3 surveys just on these 2 commodities: the coal monthly, the coal annual, and the coke monthly. The numbers that I have in brackets, 2147, 2177, if you go into Statistics Canada's website and search the name of the survey and that number, you will find out the methodology of the survey, a copy of the questionnaire, some background information, and the types of data that are collected. To have this information on methodology, on data that is collected, is what we refer to as metadata. And it's important to have this metadata for each of the surveys. You will observe this is our surveys on crude oil and natural gas. And these are covered in the next 4 slides. But again, here's the types of data that are collected and more information in terms of the various data for that particular survey. I know there is no natural gas here in Mongolia, but the reason I wanted to show this slide comes back to what I mentioned before. We have our gas companies and our electricity companies telling us where the natural gas is used. This particular survey, 5215, does exactly that. And here's another survey, natural gas disposition. It's an annual survey, and again provides other information on natural gas. Last slide on crude oil and natural gas. What I wanted to point your attention to is this particular survey here on oil and gas extraction. If you notice in the first bullet, it mentions that the survey is paid for or funded by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. What I'm trying to point out here is again the partnership that Statistics Canada has with its association, with its provincial governments and other departments. It is my understanding from what I've read in some of the newspapers that Mongolia is planning to have a major investment in an oil refinery and maybe at some time some pipelines. So I included this slide just for information. If ever there are surveys that you will undertake, you will have some reference points for these. But for us, the last survey, which is the monthly refined petroleum product survey, is a key survey for us. Again, this is information or surveys, just for your information, on the different types of pipeline surveys and the description of the surveys and the type of information you could be asking if ever you have pipelines in Mongolia. So in this particular case, we do surveys on a monthly basis. In this particular case, we do survey on an annual basis. This is a very interesting and very valuable survey. It tells which commodities are consumed. It tells the different uses in manufacturing and which industries is consuming the energy. I again point out the fact that the National Statistics Office has undertaken a survey of this nature and will be, from my understanding, publishing this information by the end of this year. The only other information I want to point out about this particular survey is, again, the partnership. Our Natural Resources Department and our Environment Department are very concerned or want to have information on energy consumption. And they help fund this survey. So in the manufacturing sector, we have 3,000 establishments that we cover on consumption. And we blend that with the other information that I mentioned to you from the electricity companies and from the gas companies in terms of end use of energy. All to come up with this. So you have all your fossil fuels that we collect information for. Then we collect information on primary and secondary electricity and your crude oil refined products and that are imported. And all of this to try to make up your so-called domestic production or total supply. And again, is where does this supply go to? Where is it used? What industries? What fuels, etc.? Is it exported? What sectors? And we have this table pretty well for each of the regions in Canada. Thank you.